Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
Too big to fail? City College of San Francisco, the state's largest community college, faces closure due to poor leadership. It's vowing to make corrections. California's controversial high-speed rail project wins funding approval from state lawmakers, but legal roadblocks remain. Federal agents step up enforcement of California doctors who overprescribe highly addictive painkillers that have led to deadly overdoses. Plus,
the Occupy movement is less than a year old, but now some of its most provocative images have made it to a major museum. I'm Scott Schaefer, and coming up, we'll see the significant role that Bay Area artists have played in giving voice to the 99%.
Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Thuy Vu, sitting in tonight for Belva Davis. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. On our news panel tonight are David Lazarus, consumer columnist for the Los Angeles Times, joining us from the KTLA studios. And in our studio, Christina Jewett with California Watch. And Nanette Asimov, San Francisco Chronicle education reporter. Thank you all for being here. Nanette, let's start with you and with the City College of San Francisco. It's being threatened with losing its accreditation. Right. This is huge. This is a campus with 90,000 students. How did this happen, and how are school officials responding?
Well, you know, this is really a story of good intentions gone very much awry, because California's master plan for higher education said that the community colleges in California are supposed to be open and accessible, free for everybody. And it was an idea that in San Francisco, the leadership just did not want to let go of. So even as the state has cut from the economic crisis millions of dollars from City College's budget, the school continued to operate, and does to this day, 9 campuses, 100 or even 200, they don't know how many, instructional sites.
They didn't make cuts.
They did not make cuts.
Funding cuts.
Exactly. They didn't shrink down because they didn't want to, because they love the kids. They love to, provide education, and it was important to them. But in so doing, they abdicated the fiduciary responsibility that they needed to do.
And so this isn't a case of ill will or bad behavior or ethical problems. It was a case of someone wanting to do good for the students, but at the same time failing to keep up with the administrative needs that needed to happen.
And so what they did in 2006 was, we have this accreditation, which is a federally mandated process, and you're supposed to listen to what the accreditation report says or evaluators say. In 2006, they came and they said, look, you guys need to shrink down, you need to have better planning, you need to, even academically, you need to be able to say what your academic outcomes are in a more consistent manner. City College did not do that. Instead, they shrunk their administrators down to 39. And remember, it's 90,000 students, 39 administrators.
Not too many.
Not too many. So they don't have enough administrators. They just didn't do anything that the accreditation said 6 years ago. And now they came and they evaluated, and the problems have all, of course, gotten worse.
They didn't meet their fiduciary obligations.
Right.
I think David Lazarus actually has a question for you. David?
Yeah.
Well, Nanette, along these lines, we had a similar debacle down here in Southern California about 6 years ago when Compton College lost its accreditation. It, in turn, was taken over by El Camino Community College and became a satellite of that other one, which is a possibility for the San Francisco campus. And yet, since then, we've seen the same financial troubles that plagued Compton in the first place. And this year, we even had a grading scandal involved. Right. So does anyone think that any kind of rescue measure for San Francisco Community College could actually work?
Well, what's happening right now is that City College of San Francisco has until October 15th to provide an action plan. They're working on that. They are not listening to talk of closure. They are adamantly trying to save it. But everybody, and they have until March 15th actually to fix all of their problems, fix 6 years of problems in just 8 months. But they're looking to Compton College, which you mentioned, David, because it's the only school that had its accreditation yanked and therefore had to close. So as a result, that's the only model that we have. And as you said, another college came in. So what if that happened in San Francisco? If the accreditation were actually yanked, next June the commission would say that the school had to close, and the students might not actually notice a difference because somebody else might come in and take over leadership, change the academics. We would see a situation possibly similar to what happened in Compton.
And Nanette, does this mean something different for a student who's on a career path versus a San Francisco resident who just wants to take Spanish for personal enrichment?
So that's a really good question because, as we've said several times, it's a huge school. It will have to shrink. They know that. Even if the accreditation weren't yanked, we would not see this vast school. And so I think just 30,000 or so students take classes for credit. There's more who take licensing. Those would be the protected groups. Those who would no longer maybe, we don't know exactly what it would look like, but least priority would be those students who just want to take the Spanish class or interesting course.
Well, let's talk about the larger picture, because this is not a problem confined to just City College of San Francisco. We're talking about education cuts across the board that have affected many colleges and universities. If this place closes, what does that say for the state of education? And are there other colleges in California facing this very similar dilemma?
Well, specifically facing accreditation problems, there's really only two small ones in the same position as City College of San Francisco. And one of them is in San Luis Obispo and one of them is in Eureka. But more interesting maybe to all students of community colleges is the fact that the master plan for higher education no longer really can apply to open access for all. And at this moment, the Board of Governors of community colleges are shrinking the mission. So every college is going to have to be focusing on students who really need to transfer to four-year schools and get a license, and we're shrinking down, and that's what we're going to see.
Well, it's not a good picture, that's for sure. I know you're going to stay on top of this, and we will keep two dates in mind: October 15th, when they need to meet the deadline, showing how they'll make improvements, and then March 15th is when they face closure if they don't meet all the requirements.
That's the day.
All right. Well, thank you, Nanette. Let's turn now to transportation and to David Lazarus. David, last week the state legislature narrowly approved funding for the first phase of high-speed rail, finally. But it's not exactly a smooth ride ahead, is it? Still lots of hurdles. What are they?
Well, the hurdles are very clear. I mean, there have to be some environmental reports done. A lot of lawsuits will be pending. But the main thing is money. And as with what Nanette was just talking about with the schools, there just isn't enough greenback to go around. All right, so let's look at what we're talking about here. In 2008, California voters approved a high-speed rail, ostensibly from San Francisco to L.A. You'd be running at speeds of more than 200 miles per hour. It would do the run in a little over 2.5 hours. Sweet. Sounds really good. And ever since then, well, it's been one problem after another, and now gerrymandering and boondoggling has got us to the point where I don't know if Californians are ready for the pig in a poke that they think they have bought. Now, let me tell you where we're at on this thing. The Senate, following the legislature, has approved roughly $8 billion in spending on the first leg of this. That would run roughly from Fresno to Bakersfield. And as you know, there's this burning demand for high-speed rail from Fresno to Bakersfield.
Well, it's been Dutch the train to nowhere, right, David?
Well, I'm being facetious, but here's the thing is, if you don't build a project that people want, people won't use it. And the state of California, at least our lawmakers, seem to have adopted the idea that, well, field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. That's not how high-speed rail works. And in fact, Japanese officials, French officials, they who run the Shinkansen, the TGV in France, have looked at our project and said, you know, this can work, but let's face it, your market is in San Francisco and LA. People who want to go very quickly between those two hubs. So the idea that
It's not
sorry?
going to be. I'm sorry. It's not even going to be a high-speed rail. Is that right? It's a sort of a medium-speed rail.
Well, it's what's called a blended system right now, where in theory you'll get the high-speed rail in the Central Valley, although with stops in Palmdale, Fresno, Gilroy, Bakersfield. But once you start getting into the urban areas on the peninsula and then down here in Southern California getting into LA, you're going to stop the high-speed rail tracks and it'll hit normal urban rail tracks, which means it'll chug along like Thomas the Tank Engine, dun 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 dun. And that's not what anyone thought that they were going to be getting here. In fact, it's an open question as to whether that's what the law even accommodated, which could make some of these lawsuits very dangerous.
And David, Christina has a question for you now.
Yeah, David, I'm curious. Lowenthal, Samidian, some of these lawmakers who had a burning desire to see this happen are now voting against it. I mean, what are they talking about?
What they're talking about is right idea, wrong plan. And they've been very clear about saying this specific plan is derailing California's high-speed rail plans. And I think to some extent they're right, because I'm also a huge fan of high-speed rail, loved this idea when it was first floated. And yet now that we see what's actually on the table, with a lot of our state lawmakers having pushed the ideal track off of the I-5 corridor, where it made a lot of sense, and moving it further east so it would go up these other cities like Fresno and Bakersfield, well, suddenly now it looks like a whole lot of gerrymandering, and I think that's what legislators like Samidian are responding to, are saying that's not what we had in mind originally, and it's also a very open question as to whether all those jobs, the tens of thousands of jobs that were promised when this project was first floated, whether they'll ever even materialize.
Well, that's what they've said. They've promised 450,000 jobs over the 25-year span of this project, and people are now questioning whether that will happen. But I think Christina brought up a good point when she brought up Quentin Kopp, which is, here's a man who was the San Francisco lawmaker for a very long time. He was the rail authority chair, and not only that, he fought for 20 years to have high-speed rail happen, and now he's coming out against the current plan. And so when he's coming out against the current plan, you've got to take note and go, why? He has said that this is a plan that will not allow electric power to happen, and therefore the trains won't travel as fast. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly what Mr. Kopp said. And in fact, he's been one of the big boosters, as you noted, for a long time now. And he says this wasn't the plan that I envisioned, and that's why he's turned against it. But let's keep our eye on the ball here. The big question is going to be money. We've got this $8 billion in startups, and that means that the state of California is going to borrow, yes, borrow about $4.5 billion, $2 billion of which will go towards, well, BART, Muni, things that have nothing to do with this, for example. That'll free up a little more than $3 billion in federal funds, but current projections put the cost of this project at about $70 billion. You know it's going to be more than that. Where's this money going to come from? We don't know.
And David, wasn't there a field poll that said, we really don't, voters don't want to spend the money on that, and if they do, then they're really not that enthusiastic about Jerry Brown's tax measures on the November ballot.
And
so
in fact,
what's the connection there?
Well, actually, there was another poll also done by your organization, David, the LA Times and USC, and according to the people they polled, 70% said they would not ride this rail transit system if it were to happen. So you've got to kind of think about that and take that into consideration as well. We've got to move on.
Absolutely.
We've got to move on, but you stay there because we want you to chime in on the next story, okay? Let's turn to Christina Jewett now, and let's talk about the growing concerns over abuse of prescription drugs, including OxyContin. This is massive. This is something that the CDC is calling an epidemic, and now an East Bay doctor is under investigation. What's going on with that situation?
Absolutely. I mean, broadly, you've got an issue where in 2009, for the first time in decades, you have more people dying of drug overdoses than you have people dying in car crashes. So this is a sea change, and that's being driven by huge increases in people dying from these opioid painkiller drug overdoses. And what I've been working on is an article about a doctor in the East Bay, and he was prescribing amounts of these opioid pain pills that were really sort of off the charts. Doctors have come together and agreed that when you have about 200 milligrams of morphine, that's a high dose. The doctor, Edward Manoogian, that I wrote about, he had a patient on 2,500 milligrams of morphine. That's 12 times the high dose. And that man died, and he died of an overdose on the drugs that were being prescribed to him. And some of the drugs that were being prescribed to him weren't even in his system, which the experts for the medical board said, this guy may have been selling these on the street. So you're looking at a pretty big issue.
So what is the incentive for doctors to do this? I mean, was he driving a Mercedes, or what was the...
You know, this doctor was not driving a Mercedes. I saw his car when I interviewed him. He was driving a very middle-of-the-road vehicle. He's very philosophically solid on the fact that there's no limit on how much opioid painkiller that you can prescribe to patients who are in this type of pain. But there have been doctors in Southern California. David's colleagues at the LA Times have written about doctors who are rich. They're driving Mercedes, and there's some prosecutions over those cases as well. So you see a whole spectrum here, but it's definitely a problem when you've got these addiction and overdose deaths that are just continue to climb.
Well, this doctor obviously is not alone, and in fact there are many instances of people going what they call doctor shopping, going from one doctor to another until they find one that will give them the painkillers that they're looking for. Are there no state regulations for something like this?
You know, the interesting thing we found in this story was that the doctor's defense is that the medical board has a rule that you cannot discipline a doctor no matter how much he prescribes to a patient with intractable pain. But there are big asterisks to that. So the doctor has to do other things to make sure they're being careful, that they're being thoughtful, that they're being really thorough when they're treating those patients. But amount alone, it's really not on the books in California.
So is that something that anybody's looking at? Can they tweak the law, change it somehow?
Great question, Annette. The state of Washington has passed a very controversial law where when patients get up to 120 milligrams of morphine, this is less than 2 full-strength OxyContin pills, you're supposed to refer those patients to a pain expert to take a really thorough look at what's going on with this patient, what can we do we want to go higher and higher before we, take a really careful look at what the other options might be.
But that's not something California is considering right now.
Not that I know of. It's incredibly controversial in Seattle. There are a lot of doctors against this because doctors tend to have a very strong belief that they shouldn't be told what to do in that really granular sense of 120 milligrams, here's what you have to do. I mean, doctors have a lot of training, and they want that autonomy.
They want the freedom to prescribe what they feel is necessary. Let's turn to David. He has a question for you as well.
Hi, David.
Well, I just want to look at the demand side of things for a moment. How much does the war on drugs, and by drugs I mean marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and others, how does that play into this, leading people into the legal drugs, and whether that increases demand for it and whether that's exacerbating the problem?
That's a really interesting question, David, because the answer is almost reverse of your question, because what they're seeing is that people are going from the opioid analgesic drugs over to heroin in some cases. I mean, this is something that's supported by anecdote. When you start to dig in and look for data on this, it's very hard to get any hard numbers, but you do see people going from those drugs that your doctor says are okay over to drugs that you can buy on the street.
Well, the FDA recently went against a panel of experts and decided not to mandate specialized training for doctors who prescribe painkillers. Why did they do that?
That's very controversial, and this is, I don't think the book is closed on the dialogue over this issue. I think that we're going to see a lot more conversation about this because, when you see these addiction numbers and the deaths escalating, I think that everyone's going to be at the table and there's going to be more conversation.
Are there any estimates at all as to how many people are addicted to painkillers in this country?
I haven't seen that. The controversial numbers that are out there are that 116 million people are in chronic pain, and some of the doctors I've talked to feel like that's almost a laughable number because that's really 1 in 3 in America, and they feel like that conversation that so many people are in chronic pain has really opened the floodgates for this type of prescribing. So it's an ongoing question.
And definitely an ongoing problem as well. Christina, thank you. And we're going to take a moment to thank David right now for being part of our panel tonight, because I know, David, you need to go. Enjoy your Friday night. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, good to see you as always. We want to tell you about another story. The Bay Area has a long tradition of combining social activism with art, and it can be a very powerful form of persuasion. And a current example, the Occupy movement. It began less than a year ago, but it's already inspired art that has people talking. KQED's Scott Schaefer takes a look at some of the most iconic images to come out of the movement.
Last September, when the first tents went up just blocks from Wall Street, it was hard to imagine a fledgling stand against economic inequality would eventually ricochet worldwide.
One of the most dramatic features of it is that it's been almost completely nonviolent from the beginning. It's more of a kind of an artistic statement. People kind of peacefully occupying the parks with guitars, singing songs, and making art.
Once it took root, the message of Occupy went viral, branded initially by a single iconic image.
And it all started out with a poster of a woman, like a modern ballet dancer, standing on one foot on top of the bull on Wall Street. And it was very cryptic. It just said, "Occupy Wall Street, September 17th. Bring tents."
The editors of Adbusters, a Canadian anti-consumerist magazine, were the creative minds behind the ballerina and the bull poster. As the movement grew to cities like Oakland and San Francisco, other artists followed their lead, including Berkeley illustrator Eric Drucker.
You're going to grab people by their eyeballs, something that's either very beautiful or very funny or just some powerful aesthetic statement that's going to make them look, and then maybe they'll show up.
Drucker makes a living producing graphic novels and satirical covers for the New Yorker magazine. But his true labor of love has long been guerrilla-style street art.
If something is on the street and doesn't get peeled off or covered up and it's up for a full week, thousands of people are going to see it. Wealthy people, poor people, everybody.
Over the past year, he's created a series of bold images for Occupy gatherings.
This was the poster that got picked up the most. And I think it's because it's a very optimistic image. So I think that's why this one stuck in the collective consciousness here as well as in other countries.
Like Eric Drucker, Oakland artists Jesus Barraza and Melanie Cervantes have long had a passion for art that both agitates and inspires.
This is the translated version into Spanish, but the initial version that we did said "Foreclose on the 1%," and it was done for an action here in Oakland.
Even before Occupy, the two were making screen prints to promote a variety of causes in a style firmly rooted in Chicano poster art tradition. Heroic portraits of everyday people are a recurring theme in their work.
This is the first design that we did in relationship to the emergence of Occupy, and it was in response to the lack of people that look like my dad and other people of color. It says, "We are the 99%. I'm blamed for the economic crisis, but what about the Wall Street banks?"
Since last summer, we've probably produced and given out something like 3,000 posters.
In a development most activist artists couldn't have imagined, their work is now lining the halls of a major museum. It's part of an Occupy art exhibition. And if you think about it, it's a pretty radical idea, given that the movement is less than a year old.
It's very unusual that an institution would have something topical like that while it's happening. Typically, a museum, if they're going to deal with something that has social criticism in it at all, they'll wait till it cools off.
The inspiration for doing the Occupy Bay Area exhibition was seeing the strength of the political posters that were coming out of the Occupy movement. We were very conscious of wanting to show a lot of different styles, a lot of different approaches. Some are very conceptual and minimal, like the one with the pie that says, "Occupy everything." And others are just very personal illustrations that are very subjective, and there's an intimacy to the image. Even though Occupy started on Wall Street, it was taken up in the Bay Area with great fervor because we have a deep legacy of political activism here.
Juxtaposed with the current posters are images from past political struggles, including prints by famous artists like Robert Bechtel and Rupert Garcia.
You see posters by artists working now who clearly have looked at Emory Douglas, who was the main graphic designer for the Black Panthers, have clearly looked at the psychedelic posters from the 1960s. Sanaz Mazanani, who is originally from Iran, blended photography from Occupy movement with the Arab Spring. What she's done is she's created a mosaic, a kind of Islamic pattern of these images. Another artist is Megan Wilson, who has made over 100 colored panels that say we are the 99% in about 45 different languages.
It is kind of like this question of like, how do you reflect as you're still moving? Like we're so action oriented that we don't take time to really understand, what's worked. What posters did we create that actually moved people, that made them feel connected, that made them get involved?
The Occupy Bay Area exhibit is at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco through October 14th. And that's all for tonight. I want to thank our guests very much and also ask you to visit kqed.org/thisweek for our show archives, to subscribe to our newsletter and podcast, and to share your thoughts about the program. I'm Thuy Vu. Belva Davis returns next week. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Major funding for arts programming on This Week in Northern California is provided by Diane B. Wilsey. Additional funding comes from the George Frederick Jewett Foundation, Helen Sarah Steyer, and Gretchen Kimball.